Night does something to the human imagination. When the air cools and the horizon folds into a single dark line, every sound grows teeth. A jackal's cry becomes a warning, a gust under the door becomes a whisper, and the unknown begins to ask its patient question: what lives in the places we cannot see? According to legend, the answer took on shapes. It learned our languages and our landscapes. It wore desert dust and ocean foam, mountain snow and swamp fog. It borrowed faces from hunger, from envy, from grief, from the dread of being alone. And we called those faces by many names: the devourer in the dunes, the eater of the dead, the shadow that steals breath, the eye that watches from the waterline. There's a version that says the first monster was not a creature at all, but a boundary, the line between the village fire and the outer dark, between what we know and the great field of uncertainty. Cross that line without preparation, and the world replies with fangs. Another version says the first monster was time, because time consumes everything, and so we gave it claws to make sense of its quiet appetite. But archaeology reminds us that fear leaves artifacts, too. Amulets etched with protective eyes, door lintels painted with warding hands, footprints of ritual in ash circles, and stone thresholds. Wherever people lived, there are traces of agreement, spoken or not. The night is large, so let us name what it contains. Imagine a traveler under a crescent moon, walking the caravan roads that stitched together the old world. Sand hushes the steps, stars burn with indifferent clarity. The traveler has heard stories, told in the rhythmic cadence of markets and firesides. In these stories, a figure waits near abandoned wells and lonely cairns, where wind makes the only music. According to legend, it is clever. It knows the sound of human sorrow. It mimics a child's cry or a wounded pilgrim's plea. And when compassion brings you closer, it reveals its true hunger. The Arabs called it the ghūl. In the plural, gullet. The name itself carries a low growl, as if language kept a safe distance from the mouth that speaks it. The ghūl is only one mask among thousands, but it is a good place to begin. Ghouls appear in tales as scavengers of the liminal. They haunt graveyards, crossroads, and the edges of habitations, places where the rules feel thin. They are not kings of the underworld or architects of fate. They are opportunists, shaped by scarcity and the moral anxieties of travel and burial. Notice the pattern. When a culture worries about unclean rest for the dead, about the safety of the road, about strangers at the edge of town, a creature arrives to hold all those worries in one body. The myth becomes a tool, a story-shaped lantern. Carry it with you, and the dark becomes legible. But the ghūl was never alone. Far to the north, fog gives bodies to fears that prefer the cold. In forests where winter writes long chapters, tales speak of a hunger you cannot satisfy, a spirit that freezes the heart and stretches the stomach, that wears a face stretched too thin by desire. It goes by different names among Algonquian-speaking peoples, but the echo is consistent. A warning about greed, about consuming more than you need, about what happens when hunger turns moral and metaphysical. There's a version that frames it as possession, another that frames it as metaphor, and a third that sits between them, as many indigenous teachings do, reminding us that human life is woven through the more-than-human world in ways modern language often forgets. Across the sea, in lands where rivers make mirrors and mangroves hide their green intentions, the night learns to swim. Eyes flash just above the surface, and voices travel in unexpected directions. In Southeast Asia, according to legend, there are beings whose heads and entrails lift from the body at night, trailing a hunger that smells like iron and salt. The details shift by region, names change, taboos differ, but the function aligns. Fears around childbirth and blood, around vulnerability at thresholds, around illness traveling invisibly through communities. The monster here serves medicine and ethics at once, teaching precaution through story when written manuals are rare, when knowledge must be sung and repeated and dramatized to survive. Why do these figures persist? Because they stabilize the weather of emotion, because they let communities pour unmanageable fears into a container with rules, because a named terror can be negotiated with, bargained with, warded against. Salt at the doorstep, iron at the bed frame, prayers at the mouth of a cave. Symbol follows function. There's another refrain that matters. Monsters are local. They wear the ecology on their skin. Desert spirits mimic thirst. Forest spirits echo starvation. River spirits speak in drowning. Mountain demons stride with avalanches at their heels. The costume is not random. It is stitched from climate, from food supply, from how people move and trade and bury their dead. But science says, someone might object, these are only stories. Science does say the world has patterns, and that fear is a survival advantage. Psychology adds that the mind loves agency, even in shadows. Better a predator you can anticipate than a blankness you cannot. Anthropology adds that communities with shared narratives coordinate better against danger. And religion studies add that what you fear shapes what you worship and what you forbid. None of this cancels the story. It explains why the story works so well. According to legend, every oath you break feeds something. According to legend, envy grows teeth when you do not acknowledge it. According to legend, a house without words of welcome becomes a house of whispers. These are not zoological claims. They are moral technologies disguised as creatures, cautionary diagrams you can tell around a fire. Let us set our promise clearly. Here at the threshold, we will walk through deserts and tundras, over mountain passes, and along coasts where the tide keeps its own counsel. We will meet the eater of corpses and the eater of luck, the spirit that rides sleep paralysis, and the eye that spoils harvests with a look. We will not glorify cruelty, nor pretend that terror is glamorous. We will listen to what each culture feared losing: food, children, reputation, guidance from the dead, and what each culture feared becoming: greedy, faithless, impure, alone. Then we will ask the same question in many dialects. What does this creature teach? When the fear settles and the lesson remains. There is a version that says demons are the shadow of law. Every rule casts a shape behind it, and in that shape lives the penalty for forgetting. If you neglect the rites of burial, a ghūl inherits the grave. If you hoard during winter, a devourer takes up residence in your ribs. If you speak someone's true name with malice, a slander spirit deafens your house to blessing. The logic is simple and powerful. Make the rule memorable by making the consequence unforgettable. But archaeology speaks again. Through residues and residues, we find traces of feasts for the restless dead, charms for safe birth, carved eyes above doorways in cities that fell and were rebuilt. The material world colludes with the narrative one. Both declare that fear, managed skillfully, is a kind of wisdom. Our approach will be patient. We will not collect monsters like postage stamps. We will let each one breathe its native air, meet it on its path, and watch what happens to the human face when the tale is told. The emphasis is not taxonomy, but meaning. What are we guarding? What are we grieving? What appetite do we mistrust in ourselves? So much that we exile it into a creature, and then outlaw the creature. Consider the ghūl once more, standing by the cairn. The wind changes direction, and sand writes brief sentences no one else will read. You, traveler, are tired, thirsty, and a little proud of your endurance. The voice you hear could be a child, or a fox, or a spirit that learned the pitch of pity from 1,000 roadside rescues. How do you decide? The story gives you a method. Do not go alone. Do not answer in haste. Do not leave the path at night. Leave a gift of water for the nameless dead. In this way the monster becomes a curriculum. It drills you in habits that keep you alive, and it does so with images strong enough to resist forgetfulness. There is a final promise to make before we step deeper. We will be careful with names. Some names are living heritage. Some are misheard across centuries. Some have been used to wound the people who first spoke them. We will choose humility. We will say, according to legend, when we speak the old way. There is a version, when the story has many branches, but archaeology says, when the soil argues for a different calendar. This is not about debunking what people believed. It is about honoring why they believed it, and how those beliefs protected them, ordered their communities, and made beauty out of dread. Now the horizon darkens more fully. Fires appear like small planets, each with its own gravity of voices. Someone begins a story with the oldest opening in the world. Listen. And so we do. Because in listening we join a long line of people learning the shape of their fears, turning them slow as stones in the pocket, recognizing their edges, and finding within those shapes the first tools of wisdom. If the monsters are mirrors, we will look steadily. If they are maps, we will learn their legends and their scales. If they are guardians of thresholds, we will greet them at the door with courage, courtesy, and a well-lit lamp. When you are ready, we step onto the road, and the road, as always, begins just beyond the last safe light. There are places on the earth where silence feels older than language, where the air carries the weight of unspoken things, and even daylight moves cautiously. These are the places where legends are born, not from fantasy, but from necessity. Before scripture, before ink, people read the world in storms and shadows. The ground itself was their library, the stars their annotations, and the night their classroom of imagination. To understand the origin of demons and monsters, we must first understand the landscape that raised them, because geography writes character, even for spirits. In the heat of the Middle Eastern deserts, life demanded vigilance. Travel meant risk. Water was a covenant between strangers. The horizon stretched mercilessly, endless, repetitive, disorienting. And so, the people of Arabia shaped stories that mirrored that peril. When the dunes moved like waves and mirages blurred distance, they imagined beings that also blurred boundaries. The ghūl, the ifrit, and the shayn, spirits that wandered the wastelands, testing those who dared to cross. They warned travelers to respect the desert silence, to honor its rules, and to never assume they walked alone. Meanwhile, far to the north, in icy forests under endless winter skies, other fears took shape. Here, the cold itself was alive. Hunger could strip away humanity as efficiently as claws. Among the Algonquian peoples of North America, tales told of the Wendigo, a spirit born from greed and starvation. According to legend, when a human consumed another in desperation, the soul warped into something hollow. Tall as the pines, thin as famine, the Wendigo's hunger was eternal. Its heart turned to ice, its voice a wail carried through frozen branches. It was not simply a warning against cannibalism. It was an ethical compass, a story that guarded the boundary between survival and moral ruin. Move again, to the humid jungles and islands of Southeast Asia, where night smells of fruit and rain. There, the terror was not famine or thirst, but the fragile threshold between life and death. Illness and childbirth were constant tests. From these fears rose the Penanggalan in Malaysian lore, the Kraju in Thailand, the Manananggal in the Philippines, women whose heads detached from their bodies at night, organs trailing like ghostly veils. They hunted the weak and the newborn, feeding on blood or breath. To Western ears, the image sounds gruesome, but in its native context, it carried a practical message. Protect mothers, tend the sick, respect taboos around death and purity. In these cultures, the monster did not only frighten, it instructed. Far west, across the Mediterranean, ancient Greece composed its own nightmares, set to the rhythm of philosophy. There, monsters were not only enemies, they were questions. What is the limit of human pride? What happens when mortal ambition trespasses divine order? The Gorgons, the Echidna, the Chimera, the Minotaur, each was a metaphor carved in mythic flesh. They turned abstract ideas into living symbols. Hubris, temptation, jealousy, forbidden knowledge, all took shape as beasts to be slain or feared. And in slaying them, heroes defined civilization itself. Across the Indian subcontinent, the conversation between gods and demons was less about opposition and more about balance. Here, the Sanskrit term asura did not always mean evil. In early Vedic tradition, asuras were powerful beings, rivals to the devas, not their opposites. Over time, the moral line shifted, and they became embodiments of disorder and ego. But even then, the story refused to flatten them. Each demon represented a force of nature, pride, wrath, confusion, that could be redeemed or destroyed depending on the human response. It was not a war between good and evil, but a dialogue about how light and darkness coexist in every being. In Japan, the landscape of belief grew even more intricate. Volcanoes, rivers, forests, everything breathed with spirit. The Shinto worldview did not separate the sacred from the natural. It saw the divine in wind, in stone, in the fox that blinked between cunning and wisdom. From this ecology of reverence emerged the Oni, horned ogres that punished arrogance and mocked hypocrisy, and the yokai, a vast pantheon of mischievous, sorrowful, or vengeful entities reflecting social fears. Some were protectors in disguise, others, echoes of neglected emotions. They were, in a sense, spiritual weather, a reminder that imbalance in the moral climate would summon storms of its own. Travel again to Africa, a continent where cosmology dances with rhythm and ancestry. Among the Ashanti, tales of the Sasabansum, a creature with dangling legs and iron hooks, warned hunters not to wander too deep into sacred groves. In Nigeria, the Mamiwata spirit shimmered between beauty and danger, a siren of wealth and temptation who rewarded or punished based on respect. These stories were not merely superstitions. They were environmental ethics encoded in myth, rules for survival disguised as wonder. Don't exploit the forest. Don't desecrate the water. If you forget, the spirit will remind you. And in Europe, the birthplace of countless later interpretations, darkness crept through castles and cathedrals alike. The vampire, the werewolf, the succubus, the banshee, each borrowed from older roots, layered with Christian morality and medieval fear. They embodied sin, lust, plague, and death, yet also fascination, desire, and rebellion. By giving vice a face, the church gave virtue a contrast, and by warning against the night, storytellers guaranteed that people would never stop watching it. From desert to tundra, from jungle to temple, humanity's fears have always adapted to their environment. When nature is harsh, demons are physical, teeth, claws, venom. When culture grows complex, they become psychological, vanity, deceit, power. But the function remains unchanged. The monster explains the invisible. It translates the chaos of existence into a language of form. Every myth begins at a wound, a fear of hunger, a fear of disease, a fear of punishment, a fear of losing one's place in the order of things. The demon is the scar tissue that memory builds over that fear. It is what keeps the tribe alert when the fire burns low. It is the night's way of whispering, remember what matters, or face what you have forgotten. And so the world filled with watchers, some human, some not, some kind, some merciless, all mirrors, showing what humanity could become if it ever stopped being careful. When the traveler crosses from one culture to another, the names change, but the gaze feels the same. Something in the dark still studies us, not to destroy, but to remind. Because, as every mythkeeper knows, it is not the light that teaches us what light is, but the shapes that move just beyond its reach. Shall we go deeper into the oldest roots, to the first tongues that ever spoke of fear itself? To trace the true birth of demons, we must step back, far beyond parchment, beyond scripture, beyond even writing itself, into the age when memory was the only library humanity owned. This is where the oldest fears still breathe. Archaeologists and mythologists call it the mythic dawn, a time when language was young and the line between the visible and invisible world was porous. In this twilight of history, every sound had intention, every shadow a spirit. Lightning was not weather, it was anger. Famine was not bad luck, it was judgment. And illness, especially the kind that came silently, spreading from one body to another, was possession. We have evidence not in words, but in objects. Clay tablets carved with spirals that mirrored storm patterns, bone charms shaped like beasts with human eyes, masks painted with ochre to guard the sleeper's soul. All these artifacts whisper the same truth. Humans felt watched, even in the dark, and so they began to watch back. According to scholars of early Mesopotamia, some of the first written names of demons appear in Sumerian incantations around 4,000 years ago. The Lamashtu, for instance, a female demon who preyed on mothers and infants, was both feared and invoked, because naming her granted power. Her image was carved on amulets worn by pregnant women. Her likeness, paradoxically, protected against herself. Beside her, the Pazuzu, with his leonine face and the wings of a bird, guarded households from plague-bearing winds. Evil fought evil. The logic was pragmatic, not moral. Balance the dark with a darker that obeys you. From these beginnings, the notion of demon grew not as rebellion, but as administration, a management system for chaos. Every drought, disease, or unexplained death required a cause, and the unseen world supplied one. These spirits were not yet devils. They were explanations wearing masks. They gave order to suffering. In ancient Egypt, the afterlife bureaucracy mirrored the earthly one. Gods and guardians multiplied to supervise every step between death and eternity. But beyond the solar gods and judges of Ma'at, there thrived a different kind of entity, one born from fear of cosmic disorder, called a Pep or Apophis. According to myth, this serpent of primordial chaos attempted nightly to devour the sun as it traveled through the underworld. Every dawn, the priest's chants and the people's prayers were said to help Ra's bark triumph over the serpent's jaws. It was not merely story, it was collective psychology. By naming chaos and fighting it daily, Egyptians renewed their faith in continuity. The demon here was not an outsider. It was the shadow necessary to define the day. Travel east again, to the Indus and the fertile plains, where early Vedic hymns were sung. Here, the Sanskrit root Ajura did not begin as evil. It simply meant powerful being. But power, as always, carries suspicion. When rulers abused it, when storms destroyed crops, the same word shifted, once divine, now dangerous. Language itself evolved under moral pressure. A lesson repeated across time. What we fear most is never fixed. It transforms as we do. In China's ancient myths, before emperors and dynasties, stories spoke of spirits called Hun and Pu, the dual souls of every human. If ritual failed, if death came violently, these souls could separate and wander, becoming ghūl, restless ghosts. Over centuries, as philosophies like Taoism and Confucianism formalized the cosmic order, these wandering entities multiplied into legions. Mountain demons, water demons, fox spirits, and corpse-animating Jiangshi. Each variation represented imbalance, a tear in the natural harmony. Again, the moral thread remained: maintain balance, or the world will mirror your disorder. Now let us listen to a quieter geography, the Mediterranean, cradle of metaphors. Before Christianity, the Greeks spoke of daimons, spirits of fate and genius. They were intermediaries, not villains, messengers between gods and men. Plato wrote of a personal daimonion, an inner voice guiding toward wisdom. Only later, under Roman and then Christian influence, did demon turn to demon, its meaning inverted by theology. The luminous counselor became the tempter. The whisper of intuition became the hiss of evil. And yet, beneath that moral inversion, the old structure persisted. The unseen companion that tests, challenges, reveals. In ancient Israel, the transformation took another path. The Hebrew texts mention desert spirits like Lilith, described in fragments as a night demon who harms infants and men in dreams. But even she has older roots, likely Sumerian. As cultures interwove, their myths traded faces. Lilith absorbed the fear of Lamashtu, reshaped through patriarchal societies into a warning about disobedient womanhood. She was condemned for refusing subordination, yet paradoxically empowered as the first figure to name her own freedom. Thus, the demon became political, the embodiment of what power sought to suppress. From the steppes of Central Asia to the Andes of South America, oral traditions repeated this archetype: the dangerous wanderer, the spirit who breaks rank, the creature who refuses the boundaries set for it. To early societies, such defiance felt contagious, and contagion was the truest terror. Better to exile rebellion into myth, bind it with story, and turn it into a lesson. But even then, the line between protection and persecution blurred. Many of these so-called demons were once healers, midwives, tricksters, those who dealt with liminal knowledge. When social hierarchies hardened, that liminality became threat. And so, the wise woman became witch, the guide became ghūl, the ancestor became ghost. Every culture rewrote its shadow to fit its current light. Archaeology offers physical traces of this psychological process. We find talismans buried under thresholds, shards etched with counter-spirits, human skulls arranged in protective circles beneath foundations. Each marks a negotiation between belief and fear. When a people could not control nature, they controlled narrative instead. According to legend, even the gods feared their own creations. In Mesopotamian myth, the goddess Tiamat, chaos itself, birthed monsters to avenge her slain children. The hero Marduk defeated her and used her body to form the heavens. But victory did not erase her. It institutionalized her. Every Babylonian temple carried echoes of her divided form, walls symbolizing the tamed sea, ceilings the firmament of her still-breathing body. In this paradox, we glimpse the secret architecture of myth. Destruction does not end chaos, it defines its perimeter. Thus, the earliest demons were architects of meaning. They guarded the boundaries of law, of purity, of life and death. They gave shape to what should never be crossed. Each was a negative image of civilization itself, a reminder of what waited if order failed. And yet, beneath fear, there was intimacy. People painted these beings on bowls, wore them as charms, whispered their names in both dread and hope. Because if the demon lives outside you, you can bargain with it. If it lives within, you must change. That, perhaps, was the oldest understanding of all. So the myths traveled and mutated, from clay to parchment, from oral chant to scripture, from superstition to literature. And in every retelling, the demon evolved, not as an enemy of God, but as an echo of man. What began as a shadow cast by the campfire would soon learn to walk on its own. When you are ready, we'll follow that shadow into the next era, where empires rise, religions form, and monsters are given theology. Empires grew, and so did their shadows. As kingdoms learned to write laws, record dynasties, and collect taxes, they also learned to catalog the invisible. What once had been whispered at night now found its place on scrolls and temple walls. The unseen world acquired hierarchy, names, and, most importantly, motive. Religion, politics, and fear began to share the same vocabulary. If you could name your demon, you could name your enemy. If you could define evil, you could justify power. Thus, the monsters of the early world became mirrors for the moral ambitions of civilization. In the ancient Near East, Babylon's successors and Persia's empires reshaped chaos into structure. The Zoroastrian faith introduced a striking idea, a cosmic dualism, a universe divided between the forces of light and darkness. Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, ruled all that was good and ordered, and Grameneu, later Ahriman, ruled deceit and decay. Here, demons acquired purpose not as random wanderers, but as soldiers in an eternal war. Every drought, every betrayal, every disease became an act to the Shadow's army. And for the first time, humanity was invited to choose sides. The moral universe, once cyclical and ambiguous, now leaned toward linear destiny. It was a vision that would echo into Judaism, Christianity, and Islam centuries later. The Hebrews, returning from exile and exposed to Persian cosmology, began to speak more often of adversaries. The Hebrew term ha-Satan, the accuser, first described a celestial prosecutor, not a fallen angel. But over time, influenced by the neighboring belief in cosmic opposition, the figure evolved. By the Second Temple period, Satan had become not a role but a personality, an embodiment of rebellion and corruption. The universe now contained not only disorder, but a deliberate will working against divine harmony. In that shift, fear itself became organized. Christianity would inherit and amplify this architecture. The serpent in Eden became the devil. Pagan gods were rebranded as demons. Forbidden knowledge was now diabolical. By drawing boundaries around sanctity, the early church drew power around itself. And yet the imagery it used, the horns, the scales, the abyss, came directly from the very myths it condemned. The devil was the heir of all earlier chaos beings. Tiamat, Apep, the Azura, the trickster, the shapeshifter. Civilization had not banished them. It had consolidated them into one face. But not all traditions marched toward war. In the East, a different logic prevailed. In Buddhism, the demon Mara did not tempt humanity toward sin but toward distraction, away from enlightenment. He whispered comfort, fear, pleasure, pride, anything that would keep the mind from awakening. His defeat by the meditating Buddha under the Bodhi tree was not a battle but a realization. The only demon that truly exists is the one you believe. Here, evil was not an external force but an internal illusion, one that dissolves when seen clearly. This idea, that the demonic is psychological, found echoes in Taoism and later Zen. There, spirits were not to be hated but understood. Even chaos had a role within the Tao, for nothing exists without its opposite. Balance, not victory, was the goal. Meanwhile, in India, the Asuras continued to evolve within Hindu cosmology. They were not irredeemable fiends, but complex beings, often devout, sometimes righteous, whose pride or obsession led to downfall. The demon Ravana, for instance, villain of the Ramayana, was at once a scholar, a musician, and a worshipper of Shiva. His defeat by Rama is tragic, not celebratory. It is the fall of brilliance corrupted by ego. Thus, even within myth, morality stayed elastic. The demon was not simply evil. It was potential gone astray. Across the seas, in the temples of the Maya, the concept of duality took another shape. Their sacred book, the Popol Vuh, tells of Xibalba, the underworld ruled by lords of death and disease. Yet these lords were not distant devils. They interacted directly with humans, testing their cleverness through riddles and trials. Victory over them meant wisdom, not extermination. Even death was a negotiable partner in the cycle of existence. Every culture was, in essence, performing the same alchemy, turning the chaos of experience into the order of narrative. And demons, in that process, were no longer mere intruders, but instruments of instruction. They tested the heroes, exposed hypocrisy, revealed limits. Without them, there could be no virtue worth naming. But there is another layer to this evolution, subtler yet more haunting. As society centralized, as kings and priests monopolized interpretation, demons began to represent rebellion itself. Those who challenged authority, philosophers, healers, heretics, were often described in demonic terms. The myth that once protected community from chaos was now used to protect power from dissent. Fear became a tool. Consider the European Middle Ages, when illness swept through villages like invisible wind. Unable to explain plague, drought, or madness, communities revived the oldest logic, find the unseen culprit. But instead of ghouls or forest spirits, the accused were human, midwives, widows, outsiders. Witchcraft became the new demonology, and every torch that burned a heretic was lit from the same primal fire that once guarded caves. The monsters had moved inside the walls. Meanwhile, the Islamic world developed its own complex cosmology of unseen beings, the jinn. Born of smokeless fire, neither wholly divine nor damned, they paralleled humanity in intellect and choice. Some deceived, some protected, some simply watched. Their world overlapped ours, separated by a veil as thin as breath. In this vision, the universe was populated not by good and evil, but by beings navigating the same moral uncertainty as we do. Once again, ambiguity triumphed over simplicity. Across continents, the conversation remained the same. What is the nature of evil? Is it a force, a will, a mirror? Can it be reasoned with, or only feared? Each culture answered in its own grammar. Each sculpted a different face for the same question. And beneath all those faces lies a constant truth. Every demon is a story about responsibility. The moment we invent evil outside ourselves, we excuse it within. The moment we recognize it within, the myth begins to heal. As civilization matured, literature, theater, and art inherited the demons of faith. No longer bound to temples, they began to roam imagination freely. Poets gave them melancholy, painters gave them beauty, and humanity began to suspect that perhaps monsters were not merely warnings, but reflections, expressions of our secret longing to understand what we are capable of. Because to fear the dark is human, but to look at it and find meaning is divine. When you're ready, we'll step into the next stage, the age when demons entered the collective imagination of art, philosophy, and science, and learned to survive belief itself. When belief became art, and art became mirror, the monsters changed skin again. The age of myth gave way to the age of story. No longer confined to temples or scriptures, demons walked the pages of poets, the canvases of painters, and the stages of early theater. They ceased to be only threats. They became characters, tragic, complex, almost human. It began quietly in ancient Greece and Rome. The playwrights Aeschylus and Euripides gave vengeance and madness their own voices. In the Eumenides, once vile furies became agents of justice, transformed by reason into protectors of balance. A culture that had invented democracy now sought to civilize its fears. The monster could be reasoned with. Order could include shadow. Later, Rome inherited this dramaturgy of terror. The poet Virgil described the underworld not as chaos, but as bureaucracy, a mirrored empire of souls. There, demons became functionaries of fate, enforcing moral law with the same precision that governors enforce taxes. And with the Stoics and early philosophers, a new notion emerged. Perhaps demons were not only external, but metaphors for passions, anger, lust, envy, despair. To master oneself was to exorcise one's inner horde. Then came the Middle Ages, 1,000 years of candlelight and contradiction. Europe's imagination swelled with visions of hell, each more detailed than the last. Artists like Hieronymus Bosch painted infernos alive with grotesque beauty, winged hybrids of man and animal, engines of punishment that looked disturbingly mechanical. They were warnings, yes, but also confessions. In their wild excess, medieval people recognized themselves, their desires, their violence, their helpless fascination with sin. The church preached fear, the artists painted empathy. During this same period, Islamic scholars were recording elaborate taxonomies of jinn, neither condemning nor glorifying them, but studying their nature with almost scientific curiosity. Texts like Kitab al-Bulhan illustrated spirits of water, air, and flame, part of a continuum rather than a corruption. The demonic, in this worldview, was not beyond knowledge. It was knowledge a shadow, requiring respect rather than destruction. Across Asia, theater turned spirits into lessons. In Japan's no plays, vengeful ghosts, or onryo, were not just frightening. They were tragic, haunted by human emotions unresolved. The mask itself, carved to shift expression under changing light, captured the essence of myth's new form, dual, ambiguous, alive only when witnessed. The audience, breathing in rhythm with the performer, learned compassion through fear. In India, the Kathakali and Yakshagana dramas used vibrant makeup to embody gods and demons as part of the same divine dance. Red eyes, green faces, black beards, all symbolized cosmic energies, not moral absolutes. To witness the performance was to meditate on balance. To play a demon was to reveal divinity disguised as chaos. Renaissance Europe rediscovered the human mind and, with it, rediscovered the devil's eloquence. Painters like Caravaggio and writers like Marlowe brought temptation into candlelit rooms. In Dr. Faustus, the demon Mephistopheles is not a brute, but a philosopher of despair, speaking lines so beautiful they almost justify damnation. This was a turning point. Evil became seductive because it understood us. The devil was no longer an intruder. It was the consequence of curiosity. Milton's Paradise Lost would later refine that paradox into poetry so grand that even rebellion seemed noble. His Satan, proud and articulate, stood for defiance, reason, ambition, all the qualities that had built empires and sparked revolutions. Theologians trembled, poets rejoiced. The demon had become the first tragic hero. At the same time, science began to rise, a different kind of myth-making, armed with instruments instead of incense. Illness was now infection, not possession. Storms had meteorology, comets had orbit, and yet the human need for mystery did not vanish. It migrated. The devil left the church and entered literature, philosophy, and psychology. Goethe's Faust refined the bargain into metaphor, knowledge at the cost of peace. The demon was no longer a creature, but a contract. In folklore, however, belief remained steadfast. Villages in Eastern Europe still whispered of vampires rising from unburied corpses. Farmers in Scandinavia left milk for house spirits, fearing their mischief more than starvation. In West Africa and the Caribbean, the old gods traveled with the enslaved, hiding inside Catholic saints, surviving colonization through disguise. There, syncretic faiths like Vodou and Santeria preserved ancient cosmologies beneath the veneer of Christian ritual. The spirits never died. They adapted, waiting for recognition in drums and dance. The Enlightenment tried to burn away the dark with reason, but reason discovered its own shadows. Philosophers wrote treatises on the sublime, the beauty of terror, the ecstasy of awe. Painters like Goya showed nightmares that felt political, not supernatural, monsters born from the sleep of reason. And romantic poets, wandering through ruined abbeys and moonlit forests, re-enchanted fear with melancholy. In their verses, ghosts became metaphors for memory, and demons for desire unrestrained. By the 19th century, science and superstition had fused into a single narrative machine, the Gothic novel. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein gave the demon a laboratory. Bram Stoker's Dracula gave it a passport. Now evil traveled with the modern age, dressed in scientific rationality, yet dripping with ancient hunger. No longer confined to caves or catacombs, the monster moved into parlors, universities, cities. The age of myth had ended, but the mythology had not. Why? Because the question remained unresolved. Where does evil live, out there or within? The stage changed, the symbols evolved, but the tension persisted. Every ghost was guilt, every vampire addiction, every demon a name for the part of ourselves we dared not meet by daylight. In this new age, the monsters no longer needed faith to exist. They fed on imagination, culture, technology. And as the world grew brighter with progress, the shadows deepened to match. The candle had become electric light, but darkness, as always, found a way to follow. When you are ready, we'll cross into the modern world, a time when mythology meets psychology, and the ancient demons learn the language of the mind. The modern age arrived with microscopes and machines, and yet, in its polished light, the shadows only sharpened. Science named the stars and dissected the body, but it could not fully map the soul. And wherever knowledge drew a border, imagination sent something crawling across it. The 20th century, with all its inventions and its wars, rediscovered the ancient truth. Demons evolved with us. They no longer haunted mountains or rivers. They haunted minds, dreams, cities, systems. Evil became psychological, systemic, and sometimes heartbreakingly human. When Sigmund Freud described the unconscious, he unknowingly built a new kind of underworld. Its inhabitants were not winged or scaled, but repressed thoughts, forbidden urges, fears that refused burial. Carl Jung went further, calling them archetypes, ancient figures encoded in our collective memory. Among them, he found what myth had always known, the shadow, the dark mirror of the self. Every culture's demon, he argued, is an externalization of this inner shadow, a way of acknowledging what consciousness denies. Exorcism became introspection. Myth became therapy. But even as psychology humanized the demonic, the century's violence reminded the world that monsters were still very real. Only now, they wore uniforms, titles, ideologies. Human cruelty outpaced legend. Auschwitz, Hiroshima, Gulag. Each atrocity forced philosophers to ask again, what is evil when no myth explains it? The old symbols returned as metaphors. Writers like Dostoevsky, Camus, and Arendt looked at history and saw that demons had moved from folklore to bureaucracy, from ritual to reason. Evil was no longer the absence of God. It was the absence of empathy. Cinema became the new campfire, and on its screens, the creatures of old learned new tricks. The vampire wore a tuxedo and spoke in perfect diction. The ghost flickered in photographs. The alien replaced the demon, same fear, different vessel. Each decade repainted the myth in the color of its anxieties. The Cold War gave us body snatchers. The nuclear age birthed Godzilla. The digital era conjured artificial intelligence and viral contagion. Every invention called forth its spirit of consequence. Still, the ancient motifs survived inside these modern costumes. The vampire remained the hunger that corrupts love. The zombie, the terror of losing selfhood in the collective. The ghost, the weight of unfinished grief. The demon, the cost of desire. Each one whispered the same refrain: control what you create, or it will control you. In this era, the battle was no longer holy but existential. When Nietzsche declared that God was dead, he did not kill belief. He exposed its hunger for replacement. Without divine order, humanity faced its own reflection with nothing to mediate the gaze. Science explained the how, but not the why. And so, art filled the void. Painters, novelists, and filmmakers built new pantheons of terror to ask the same timeless questions. Why do we hurt? Why do we crave power? Why do we fear ourselves? Monsters became allegories of conscience. Frankenstein's creature begged for compassion. King Kong mourned captivity. Even Satan, in literature and film, spoke with tragic reason, not as destroyer, but as the voice of rebellion against emptiness. The myth no longer told us what to fear. It asked us what we've already become. In folklore studies, scholars began noticing something extraordinary. The more urban the world became, the more myths multiplied. Modernity did not erase superstition, it industrialized it. Slender Man, Bloody Mary, digital demons, all new names for an ancient process. The medium changed, the ritual stayed. People still gather, now on forums instead of firesides, to tell stories that test the membrane between reality and imagination. The horror is the same. That thought alone can conjure a thing. Meanwhile, religion adapted too. Contemporary exorcisms, documented or dramatized, often read like psychological theater, a choreography of belief that still carries primal power. Even skeptics, watching the ritual, feel a shiver older than logic, because deep down, part of us still remembers the time when naming meant survival, when you could save your life by telling the right story. If ancient demons guarded the threshold between life and death, modern ones guard the threshold between truth and illusion. They live in screens, in propaganda, in addiction, in the invisible loops of technology that promise comfort while quietly harvesting attention. They no longer roar. They whisper in algorithms. They do not demand sacrifices of blood, but of time. And like the spirits of old, they are summoned by repetition, belief, and fear. According to legend, you could ward off a demon by drawing a circle of salt. Today, perhaps, the circle is awareness, a boundary of thought, a conscious pause before reaction. The tools have changed, but the lesson remains. What you feed grows. And still, amid all progress, we dream of the old ones. In the corners of our minds, deserts still whisper with ghūls, forests still echo with wendigos, seas still shift with serpents of chaos. Because these beings are not extinct, they are symbolic species. They adapt, mutate, survive extinction after extinction, as long as we fear, imagine, and tell stories. To study demons, then, is to study humanity's memory of itself, our evolving self-portrait painted in shadow. And the question that once echoed in caves still echoes through fiber optics and neural nets. When we invent monsters, what are we trying to protect? In the next part, we'll look at how those shadows are not just survivals from the past, but living myths shaping art, language, and ethics today. And how every era's monsters reveal what that era refuses to see. Every civilization tells its fears in symbols. Some use animals, others use numbers, colors, or natural forces. But when it comes to demons and monsters, symbols do more than decorate the story. They are the story. They turn abstract dread into something you can picture, name, and, if you're lucky, understand. Across the ancient world, you can see the same motifs rising like constellations. The serpent, for instance, curls through every mythology. In Mesopotamia, Tiamat is the serpent of chaos. In Egypt, Apep swallows the sun. In Greece, Python guards the oracle's cave. In the Bible, the serpent tempts knowledge itself. Sometimes it's evil, sometimes divine, sometimes both. The serpent's skin, endlessly shedding, became the perfect metaphor for time, rebirth, and the dangerous beauty of transformation. Its form slithers through art as both healer and destroyer, a reminder that wisdom and ruin are often one movement apart. Then there are the horns, universal sign of power. From the bull-headed minotaur of Crete to the horned Moses misinterpreted in medieval art, horns mark beings that stand between wildness and holiness. They belong to animals that can kill, but also protect. They represent virility, vitality, defiance. When Christian painters gave the devil horns, they borrowed the symbol of fertility and turned it into the mark of forbidden desire. Once again, meaning inverted but never erased. In the East, eyes hold a similar duality. An eye can bless or curse. The evil eye talisman, found from Turkey to India, warns against envy, the invisible poison of communities. In Buddhist and Hindu art, the third eye opens toward insight, revealing what the ordinary gaze cannot. To close the divine eye is to fall into ignorance. To open it carelessly is to see too much. So the eye, like the serpent, becomes both guardian and threat. Numbers, too, whisper their logic into myth. 3. The Holy Trinity, the triple goddess, the three-headed beast. 7. Days of creation, gates of hell, veils of mystery. 13. Chaos, rebellion, imbalance. Each number acts like a signature, repeating across cultures, because the human mind craves pattern even in terror. When chaos seems infinite, counting it feels like control. And then come the elements, the primal vocabulary of fear. Fire purifies but burns, water heals but drowns, air liberates but suffocates, earth shelters but entombs. Nearly every demonic image belongs to one of these. The fiery tempter, the watery siren, the airy ghost, the earthen beast. They are the seasons of human anxiety, cycling endlessly in art and ritual. Consider how these symbols shape behavior. If fire demons punished impurity, people built rituals of cleansing. If river spirits punished greed, communities learned to ration and respect. If ghosts haunted the unburied, societies built cemeteries and ceremonies. Fear became architecture, morality became geography, and every symbol, however dark, taught the same lesson: balance your world, or it will balance you. Even animals carried meaning. Owls in some regions symbolized death, in others, wisdom. Dogs guarded the living and guided the dead. Cats, snakes, bats, all creatures of twilight, became messengers between realms. The human eye mistrusted what it could not clearly see. So dusk itself became the hour of transformation. That is why, in countless myths, monsters appear at twilight, the color between certainty and surrender. Objects, too, turned sacred or cursed by repetition. The mirror, for example, in one story it reveals truth, in another it traps souls. To break it invites misfortune, because it fractures not glass but identity. The bell, in turn, calls spirits or dispels them depending on tone. And the threshold, a line of wood or stone, becomes a sacred perimeter, the frontier between domestic order and cosmic wild. Demons linger there because they test our boundaries. They ask the oldest ethical question: what do you let in, and what do you keep out? Every culture answers differently, yet with the same logic. Symbols survive because they work, they hold emotional charge. They allow each generation to speak to the next without explaining. A serpent, a shadow, a whispering wind, instantly recognizable, infinitely interpretable. They compress fear into art, and art into memory. Even color speaks this silent language. Red for danger, blood, life. Black for death, but also for potential, the womb of creation. White for purity, but in Asia, for mourning. Gold for divinity, green for decay and renewal alike. Each hue, like each myth, reverses depending on where you stand on the map. Meaning is not absolute, it is negotiated. And if symbols are grammar, then rituals are syntax. Lighting candles, circling salt, knocking on wood. These are not superstitions but sentences in the ancient language of fear management. They turn emotion into choreography. To perform them is to remind oneself that the world is not random, that human intent still matters. There is a quiet beauty in this system, for beneath the demon's fangs and claws lies a philosophy of order. That chaos, too, has pattern. That fear, properly named, becomes guidance. It is why, even now, our art and media recycle the same symbols without realizing it. Superhero films borrow the halo and the horns, the serpent and the savior. Video games mirror ancient labyrinths. Horror movies replay the same sacred geometry: the haunted house, the cursed object, the mirror that remembers. We do not invent, we remember, because symbols, like seeds, lie dormant until fear gives them water. And just as the ancients used them to build moral worlds, we use them now to build meaning in chaos. In politics, in technology, in identity. The serpent is still here, coiled in our logos, our architecture, our myths of progress. The mirror still waits, asking whether we will recognize the face looking back. In the next block, we will explore how those symbols, born from ritual, echo in our festivals, our languages, and even our everyday speech, long after we stop believing they were real. You may think the old myths are gone, that demons and monsters have been buried beneath data, reason, and light. But listen closely to our language, our holidays, even our jokes. The echoes are everywhere. The ancient shadows have simply changed their masks. Every culture carries these echoes in its calendar. Halloween, Dia de los Muertos, Oban Samhain, Hungry Ghost Festival, all are descendants of the same instinct, to make peace with what we fear by inviting it to the table. We carve faces into pumpkins as our ancestors carved them into wood and stone. We light candles to guide spirits home. We dress as monsters so they won't recognize us. Behind the laughter and the costumes lies the same solemn understanding. Death visits, and we must greet it kindly. In the Christian world, All Hallows' Eve was never meant to be playful. It was the vigil before All Saints' Day, a prayer for the dead. But the pagan roots refused to die. The bonfire stayed, the masks returned, and so did the feeling that one night each year, the world becomes porous. We still keep that appointment with mystery, pretending not to believe, while secretly hoping the old stories are true, if only because they make the universe feel intimate again. Move east, and you'll see the same rhythm in other tongues. In Japan, the Oban festival honors ancestral spirits, with lanterns floating on rivers, lights that look like souls returning to the sea. In Mexico, Dia de los Muertos decorates graves with flowers, sugar skulls, and music. What outsiders mistake for morbidity is actually affection, a cultural declaration that death is part of life, not its enemy. And in that music, in that color, the monsters soften. They are not punishers anymore. They are reminders of continuity. Even our idioms carry ghosts. We say someone battles their demons, wrestles with inner monsters, faces the beast. We call charming people bewitching, desire temptation, accidents acts of God. The vocabulary of myth still frames emotion, because emotions remain mythic, vast, untamed, sometimes divine. Our architecture keeps secrets too. Gargoyles perched on cathedrals once terrified medieval parishioners into reverence. Today, we photograph them as tourists. But the meaning persists. They are sentinels of sin, watchers of water and sky. Proof that even houses of worship must live with their monsters. In language and design, myth lingers like scent. The English word panic comes from Pan, the goat-footed god whose sudden appearances startled travelers in lonely woods. The word nightmare originally meant a Mara, a night-riding spirit that pressed on sleepers' chests. Even genius descends from demon, a guiding spirit once worshipped, later tamed by grammar. We speak the names every day without noticing the bloodlines. Popular culture keeps the pact alive in louder ways. Films resurrect old archetypes under new lighting. The brooding vampire as the misunderstood outsider, the zombie as the faceless consumer, the robot as the cautionary angel of progress. Comic books turn ancient epics into serialized scriptures. Every superhero movie, at its core, replays the battle between gods and demons, chaos and order, only now with satellites instead of thunderbolts. We have not outgrown Olympus, we've digitized it. Even music and fashion borrow from the forbidden. Metal bands wear horns once carved on fertility gods. Perfume names invoke sin and temptation. Brands choose serpents, wings, and halos to sell the same promise myth once offered. Power, beauty, immortality. Commerce, like religion, knows that symbols never die. They only change employers. The internet, too, has become a stage for folklore. Viral legends spread faster than any storyteller could dream. Slender Man, Momo, urban curses, haunted games. Each follows the same ritual pattern. An origin story, a taboo, a witness, and a warning. Believers gather not around fires, but screens, sharing screenshots instead of amulets. And yet the emotional circuitry is identical. To believe together is to belong. To be frightened together is to be human. There is a certain irony in this. The more secular we become, the more supernatural our culture grows. Perhaps we need these stories not because we think they're true, but because we fear a world without them would be unbearably empty. Demons and monsters, in their endless retellings, keep us tethered to wonder. They remind us that mystery is not a flaw in knowledge. It is what makes knowledge meaningful. Consider how myths sneak into morality today. Environmental movements speak of Mother Earth's revenge. Psychologists talk about shadow work. Tech critics warn of Frankenstein's monster. These are not coincidences. They are continuities. We still think in myth, even when we claim to think in data, because myth is the only language deep enough to hold fear, guilt, and hope at once. In this sense, the ancient monsters are thriving. They walk among hashtags and headlines, translated into modern anxieties, climate collapse, AI pandemic, war. But their role hasn't changed. They make the invisible visible. They ask us to see the cost of imbalance, the price of forgetting our place in the pattern. If you strip away the fangs and fire, what remains is a moral compass written in dream logic. Be humble before what you create. Be kind to what you fear. And never believe the light has no shadow. So when you hear a strange noise at night, a creak, a whisper, a flicker, perhaps it is not a ghost, but an invitation, a reminder that the story is still being told, and that you, too, are part of it. In the next part, we will look at the meeting point of science and myth, how anthropology, psychology, and philosophy decode these stories, and why they remain essential for the survival of human meaning. Science arrived, and for a moment it seemed that mystery would finally dissolve. The microscope exposed invisible worlds, the telescope stretched the sky into data, and psychology unmasked the soul as chemistry and narrative. Yet instead of erasing myth, science made it deeper. It gave the old questions new instruments, because the same mysteries that once birthed gods and demons still whisper behind every equation. Why do we fear? Why do we dream? Why does darkness, no matter how well lit, still feel alive? Anthropology was the first to listen seriously. Scholars like Sir James Frazer, Bronislaw Malinowski, and later Claude Levi-Strauss began to see myths not as superstition, but as architecture, blueprints of collective logic. They noticed that even the most remote tribes and the most modern cities told the same stories in disguise. Chaos challenged by order, death conquered by renewal, pride punished by fall. Monsters, in their view, were not errors of imagination but social teachers. They told people how to behave when the laws of the village ended and the wilderness began. Psychology followed. Freud looked into dreams and found the demons of desire, repressed wishes returning with masks of horror. Jung, looking wider, found that the same faces appeared in every culture, as if humanity shared a single deep script written before history. His theory of the collective unconscious framed myths as messages from that ancient script. The hero and the monster were two halves of the same psyche, the striving and the resisting, the known and the denied. Every slayed dragon was a conquered fear. Every descent into the underworld was a night of depression endured and survived. Meanwhile, evolutionary biology quietly agreed. Fear, it said, is not weakness, it is adaptation. The startled response, the quickened pulse, the superstition of pattern recognition, these kept our ancestors alive. To mistake a shadow for a predator costs little. To mistake a predator for a shadow costs everything. So the brain learned to err on the side of demons. Myth simply translated that instinct into poetry. A serpent in Eden, a ghūl in the dunes, a Wendigo in the snow, all early names for risk management. Sociology added another layer. It noticed that myths evolve alongside social structure. When people live in tribes, spirits enforce communal harmony. When they build empires, demons enforce obedience. When they build nations, monsters guard borders. And when they build networks, the demons multiply into misinformation, addiction, isolation, digital manifestations of the same ancient imbalance between control and chaos. Each age invents its devils to match its machines. But science also gave the myths compassion. Neuroscience revealed that imagination and fear share the same neural circuits. That storytelling literally rehearses survival. To tell a horror story is to simulate danger safely, to learn emotional reflexes before reality demands them. Ritual became rehearsal, belief became biology. Even the placebo effect, where faith heals without medicine, echoes the old spell. If you believe the ritual works, the body agrees. Philosophy, meanwhile, realized that banishing myth entirely would leave a vacuum. Nietzsche saw that without gods and monsters, humans risked nihilism, a world explained but not meaningful. Camus called it the absurd, the clash between our hunger for purpose and the universe's silence. And in that silence, myth returned, not as dogma, but as metaphor. Because meaning is not found in truth alone, it is forged in story. And the stories that endure are the ones large enough to hold both awe and terror. So today, the scholar and the storyteller stand side by side, each translating the same firelight into different languages. The anthropologist calls it cultural adaptation, the psychologist archetype, the physicist entropy, the philosopher the tragic sublime. But all describe the same pulse, the heartbeat that once echoed in caves and temples. To study demons is, therefore, not to study darkness, but to study how humans imagine light strong enough to fight it. The myth is not about monsters existing. It is about us existing with them, negotiating the terms of coexistence with our own chaos. Even contemporary science, in its frontier disciplines, begins to speak myth's language again. Cosmologists talk of dark matter and cosmic strings, geneticists of selfish genes and ghost DNA. The metaphors sound mythic because the unknown still demands poetry. In laboratories as in temples, wonder survives. And so the distance between priest and physicist is smaller than we think. Both stare into the void and give it a name. Both draw lines of meaning against infinity. Both invent stories that let the heart stay brave while the mind admits it does not know. According to legend, the gods created humans to tell them stories, because even immortals feared silence. Science, for all its equations, still obeys that cosmic hunger. We are pattern-making creatures, and every discovery is a new myth waiting for translation. Which brings us to the final reflection. After all these ages, all these transformations, what remains of the monsters now? What do they still offer in a world that claims to have outgrown them? And what do they reveal about who we truly are? The road has carried us from firelight to fiber optics, from cave walls to cinema screens, and still, the monsters walk beside us. They have outlived empires, crossed oceans, changed language, even changed species. Yet one thing has never changed. They remain faithful to their purpose. They remind us of the boundaries we test, the instincts we repress, and the humility we keep forgetting to practice. Every demon, every ghost, every mythic beast is an ancient mirror, not a reflection of evil alone, but of equilibrium. Because to name darkness is to acknowledge that light is precious. To imagine the monstrous is to imagine the sacred by contrast. Look back at what we've inherited. The ghūl guarding the desert, the Wendigo whispering of greed, the serpent that both tempts and heals. Each one carries an ethical core, a memory of balance disguised as fear. When you strip away the superstition, you find the same human pulse underneath. Protect life, respect limits, honor the unseen. And that unseen has always been more than superstition. It is the part of reality that language can't quite reach. The silence behind music, the dark between stars, the moment before a thought becomes a word. Science describes it in forces and fields. Myth describes it in gods and demons. Both are translations of awe. In the modern world, we often speak of facing our demons. It sounds metaphorical, but the phrase carries ancient wisdom. To face a demon is not to destroy it. It is to understand what it protects. Anger guards grief. Greed guards insecurity. Envy guards longing. Each shadow, when understood, reveals the wound beneath. That is the secret every civilization eventually rediscovers. The way out of darkness is through comprehension, not denial. Perhaps that is why myths endure, because they teach without preaching. They wrap moral insight in mystery, and allow each generation to discover the lesson rather than inherit it. A story that terrifies a child can instruct an adult, and what frightens the adult may comfort the elder. Myths grow with us, evolving as we do. They're demons aging in step with our fears. In our era, when information floods faster than meaning, we need those old frameworks more than ever. We build new pantheons, digital, corporate, ideological, and worship them with our attention. And when they betray us, we call them monsters. But the lesson remains. The demon is the warning written inside desire. It says, remember the price of forgetting what you are. Even the smallest ritual, a light switched on, a whisper of gratitude before sleep, a moment of silence before a screen, is a descendant of the old magic. It is how we still talk to the unseen. not to ask for protection, perhaps, but to remember that we are part of something older and larger than ourselves. According to legend, every soul carries two companions, one of light, one of shadow. The wise learn to let them walk together, because to deny either is to become incomplete. Civilizations that worship only purity breed fanaticism. Those that glorify darkness breed despair. But those that listen to both, that let reason and myth share the same fire, find something closer to wisdom. So what do demons and monsters offer us now? Perspective. They remind us that fear can educate, that beauty can be terrible, that imagination is not an escape from the world, but a tool for surviving it. They whisper the same lesson in every century's ear. To be human is to live between extremes, between hunger and restraint, between wonder and dread, between knowledge and faith. Perhaps, in the end, the monsters are not asking for worship or fear, only acknowledgement, because they are the shadows cast by the light of consciousness itself. Without them, the story would be flat, the sky without stars. And so, when night falls and the world grows still, listen again to that distant, ageless murmur, the sound of wind through ruins, of waves over forgotten cities, of dreams turning over in their sleep. It is the same sound our ancestors heard and called by different names. They called it chaos. They called it spirit. They called it demon. We, perhaps, can call it memory, the echo of everything we've ever feared, and everything that taught us how to live. And if you ever wonder whether myths still matter, light a candle, tell a story, and watch how the darkness moves closer, not to harm, but to listen, because for as long as we speak of them, the demons of ancient cultures are not our enemies. They are our witnesses, keepers of the night, guardians of meaning, and the proof that even fear, when faced with understanding, can become something sacred.